Hi everyone, this is Mr. Trio again, and today we are going to be discussing Paper 2, Historic Investigations. This will be a focus on tackling the B question. And the way the B question is structured is it says, how far does source A support the evidence of source B? So a really important aspect about this particular question and the C question, which I will focus on in a different video, is that there are sources which are provided in the paper that you have to use in answering your question. And it's impossible to anticipate or guess what the sources could be. I mean, after all, these are historic subjects. There are thousands and thousands of sources that exist. So it's really important for you as a student of history to be able to understand sources, and we'll get into a little bit of the understanding of source analysis a little later on in the video. As a reminder, this particular video is just talking about the question and how they answered it in general, and it doesn't matter if you are learning about the origins and course of the First World War or if you're learning about the Vietnam conflict. This particular video, however, does take information from the A2 topic because it's one of the published questions which is available that I can share with you. Now, when we talk about sources, what are things that you can anticipate about these sources? The first is that source A and B are always primary sources. And this means that they are written or created by individuals who experience the events. Sometimes they are done right at the time of the event. Sometimes they are done shortly afterwards, or it could be many years afterwards, such as a memoir. But it's always important to keep in perspective that these are primary sources. The other thing is that the sources always tell you who and when they were published. So when looking at the question in the exam, also note who and when it was published, because that is an important part of understanding how to do the analysis. And then finally, the important thing to keep in mind is that the topics are always about the same thing. So you would never get a source from the storming of the Bastille, and then the second source is about the Reign of Terror. Both of the sources would be about the same historic event. This is the official marking scheme, which is from the textbook. Let's just look at one aspect of this, and that is if you want to get into the 6 to 8 range, you need to provide an explained evaluation of the extent of the support. The sources are cross-referenced and comparisons used to support reasoning about the extent of the support. I have dedicated a small portion at the end of this video to talk about support reasoning of the extent of support, because that's perhaps where you get your last 2 marks and you can score the difference between getting a 5 out of 8 versus a 7 or 8 out of 8. An important reference I also will tack on is that you are essentially given 2 sources and that you have to establish how they agree with one another, but you also have to establish how they disagree with one another. If you only talk about agreement or if you only talk about disagreement, you can't get higher than a 5. And that's just the way that the marking scheme is set up. These sources are not there to trick you. There is something in the sources which will show agreement and disagreement. And it's just your job essentially to find out where it is. Now, what is this question all about? Well, it's the basics, as we've talked in other videos. First, you have to understand what the sources are saying, and you also have to interpret or clarify the point of view of the source. Now, cross-reference is essentially mean you have to talk about the sources as they relate to one another. You can't just talk about this is what source A says, and then later this is what source B says. You have to frame your response in source A says this and source B disagrees with that, or source A agrees with it. The details that you need to know for the B question is that essentially you should be establishing a 3-paragraph response. The first paragraph can be about agreement, the second paragraph is about disagreement, and then the third paragraph is the overall. And that's where we'll talk about the extent of reasoning at the end of the video. And of course, it's that cross-referencing, which is the most important aspect of this question. A full mark is 8, since this is the B question. So the correct structure, and I won't go through this in detail, but essentially in the first paragraph, you have to put A and B in the same paragraph in order to show how these things are related. It would be incorrect to write an essay in which all the information about source A is in the first paragraph and all the information about source B is in the second. I just want to reiterate that. I know I've said it several times at this point, but that is the thing that I often see students doing, is that they just want to talk about one source and they forget the fact that the whole idea behind this question is that cross-referencing. So here we are with our sample question. As a reminder, this publication, which is called Sample Assessment Materials, you can download this directly from the Pearson website. And for today, it's not that this video is focusing on the Russian Civil War or anything like that, but I did want to use a specific example from the sample assessment materials in order to make the process make a little bit more sense. So this is a sample question which comes from page 76 of the textbook, as I mentioned before, from that downloadable document. The first thing that you notice with source A is that it says from a diary of a white commander written in May 1919. And then notice how in source B it says in a memoir by Victor Serge, published in 1945. We will talk about this in the overall at the end of the video, but remember, it's important. They're going to tell you where these sources are coming from. And hopefully, if you've studied this topic, you'll automatically know the significance of what this is about. So keep in mind, this is a very simple response. I mean, it could be elaborated upon, but I wanted to break it down into the 3 parts in order for it to pop a little bit more so you can see how the structure should be written. One of the things that I always find somewhat interesting is that because it says, how does source A support the evidence of source B, I find it most helpful to start with talking about what B says. So, for example, in this particular statement, source B states that the whites committed numerous atrocities. And notice I used committed numerous atrocities in quotes because that's directly from the source. I start with what the B says because then I have to see if source A supports it. And then, I'm not trying to be too complicated. I just basically say, this is supported by source A. When the white commander states, we found the members of the Bolshevik committee and put them to death. B says atrocities were committed. Source A, that backs it up. That's called support. But notice the third colored section in this paragraph. The action of the white commander can be considered an atrocity since there appears to be no trial or due process involved in their execution. That is where you go beyond just the words of the source and you make meaning out of it in order to support your point of view. Remember, you have to do more than just quote entire sections from the source. You have to make sense of them. Now, as we get to the overall, how do we prove or talk about the overall agreement or disagreement? Well, one of the most useful things that I believe you can do is think about basic source analysis, the origin, the purpose, and the content. And just as a reminder, origin means who and when the sources were created. Purpose is why the source was created. And content is what information is included and what is not included. And how would that relate? Well, let's look at our two friends here. One is a Russian commander written in 1919. One is a Marxist written in 1945. The first one, you could explain why there's such a difference because one is written by a person who opposed the other. And that could help to explain why there's such a difference of opinion in the particular sources. Also, because you know that one was done at the time and one was done later, you could infer that the Marxists win, spoiler. So in 1945, Victor essentially is writing this from the perspective of he knows what the eventual outcome is. So that helps him to give his perspective. You could also write it from the purpose point of view. Think about how the commander, his purpose in writing is just about documenting the events. However, the purpose behind Victor is really to support the revolution and justify their actions in 1919. You can use this type of source analysis essentially in order to then come up in that third paragraph for this is why the sources mainly agree or why they mainly disagree. I hope you find this presentation helpful. Once again, if you want to look at the whole document, especially that sample assessment material, just go to Pearson.com with this QR code and you can download this particular PDF, which includes also indicative content on how these answers can be put together. Thanks for joining me. And don't forget about Victor and our white Russian friend, because when we get to our next video and talk about the C question, they're going to come back because the C question includes the same sources from the B question. There's a little teaser for our next segment, I guess. Thanks again.